All right, today I'm really going to try to finish the book of Leviticus. All right. And if I don't get finished, the only reason because of time, because of all his questions and drawing us. Good morning.
I'll be quiet.
I'm just kidding, of course. We may get finished, we may not.
Okay.
Of course, the Lord may return before we get finished. So
There you go.
you just got to be prepared, right?
There you
Just
go.
listen for that trumpet. All right, chapter 24. Let's jump down to verse 10. There's an interesting little story that seems to be out of place there. I want to tell you something I read about that as we read through it. Chapter 24 of Leviticus, starting in verse 10, 10 through 16. Jackie, would you read that for us?
Now the son of an Israelite woman and an Egyptian father went out among the Israelites, and a fight broke out in the camp between him and an Israelite.
Pause right there just a second. The son of an Israelite woman whose father was an Egyptian. All right, let's pause right there. Little Bible trivia question. Why was it that Moses left Egypt in the first place?
Killed an Egyptian.
He killed an Egyptian, that's exactly right. That's in the Exodus chapter 2, verse 11. It is said among the ancient Hebrew writings that this person that's being spoken of right here, the son of Israelite woman whose father was an Egyptian, that Egyptian right there is the one that Moses killed, that caused him to leave Egypt. Now, of course, this isn't in the scripture. This is just part of the tradition. What the tradition says is that Egyptian, in Exodus chapter 2, verse 11, it says that Moses saw an Egyptian who was mistreating one of the Hebrews. That mistreatment not only extended to a man, but it's also believed that Egyptian raped the wife or raped one of the Israelite women. And this one who's referred to here is the actual son of that Egyptian who Moses killed. And again, this isn't recorded in scripture anywhere. It's just part of Hebrew tradition, which I think is kind of interesting here. But anyway, read on. What happened?
The son of the Israelite woman blasphemed the name with a curse. So they brought him to Moses. His mother's name was Shelomith, the daughter of Dibri the Danite. They put him in custody until the will of the Lord should be made clear to them. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Take the blasphemer outside the camp. All those who heard him are to lay their hands on his head, and the entire assembly is to stone him. Say to the Israelites, if anyone curses his God, he will be held responsible. Anyone who blasphemes the name of the Lord must be put to death." The entire assembly stoned him, whether an alien or native born. When he blasphemes the name, he must be put to death.
All right, pause right there. So, pretty harsh, pretty strict rule. It doesn't say exactly what this guy did, what his act was, but it says that he did two things. Number one, he blasphemed and he cursed God. And as a result of that, the death penalty was pronounced upon him. So that was a pretty serious matter. What is your definition of blasphemy? Anybody know?
It's kind of like an untruth, isn't it? To make it simple. If you,
Could that-
I mean, something derogatory about the person, but I
Yeah.
mean, it's,
Well, blaspheme would be directed at God, so it'd be saying something derogatory about God. Jesus gave an example of blasphemy. Anybody remember? That's where he talks about if you blaspheme the Holy Spirit, that's something that is an unpardonable sin. But in that, anybody remember what the blasphemy was in that context?
It's taking away the praise of God and giving it to someone else, particularly to Satan.
Exactly. And the account that one was referring to, remember Jesus was casting out demons, right? And the scribes and the Pharisees came and said, he's casting out demons by the power of Beelzebub. And Jesus said, that's blasphemy. That's the worst form of blasphemy because and what Wanda said is exactly right. Giving credit, in that case, to Satan for something that God had done. Okay? And so it is thought that what this blasphemer here might have been doing is to be giving someone other than God credit for taking the children of Israel out of Egypt and sustaining them while they're in the wilderness. Okay? But again, what we should glean from this is that cursing God and blaspheming God is a very serious matter. It was so serious back then that it merited the death penalty.
do you think the Jewish people back here this early were as mixed, you know how they hated the Samaritans, because they weren't pure, went with other people and stuff like that. So you think that they were this proud of the race at this period, or that grew through time?
It could very well have been, because one of the things I read about this is that it said in verse 11 that the woman whose son blasphemed, she was of the tribe of Dan. So it said that this man, who was half Egyptian and half Jewish, he was trying to link up with the tribe of Dan, but they wouldn't let him in because he was a half-breed. Right. So he's kind of wandering around, nobody would accept him. Yeah. And so finally, he curses God. So he's cursing the whole system, he blasphemes, and that's when the punishment comes down.
Gotcha.
So yeah, that could be part of
I
it.
have a question though, where it says, and let all who were within hearing lay their hands on his head. Is that a transference of guilt?
Well, that's a good question, why they would be doing that. that sort of became the custom when they imposed the death penalty, that not only would everybody lay their hands on his head, but everybody was going to stone him, that they'd pick up a stone, right?
And because it's like the next verse is like, or right after, anyone who kills a human being shall be put to death in 17. So it's like, is that some kind of absolution if they're putting their hands on him, like I know we're going to kill you, but
Yeah, it's almost, and Nancy raised a very good point. It's almost as if you got to go through this ritual first to show this man is condemned and everybody's a part of it. So the act of killing is not an individual act, but it is an act of the entire community or the entire nation, if you will. It is the government acting as opposed to
who
individual.
laid their hands on him? It wasn't everyone.
it
The
says,
ones who
yeah.
heard
The
him.
ones who heard him.
Yeah.
Who heard him?
The
He
witness.
was fixing to be put to death based on their testimony.
Right.
Who were within hearing.
They had to put their hands on him and said, my testimony is fixing to kill you.
Mhm.
I got you.
That's what I was
Okay.
thinking, maybe it was like a jury.
It says that everyone was in
Yeah.
hearing, so whoever heard him, but
Yeah.
Yeah, it is kind of like.
I'm just like laying on the hands kind of a thing, because we were talking earlier about the scapegoat and
Yeah.
sending it out, and I'm wondering if there was some correlation between the two.
Yeah, as of this point in time, of course, we've got a lot of laws laid out. We really don't have the jury system laid out or the means of a trial, so this is...
But what is the condemnation for bearing false witness? So, I mean, these people were put on, I mean, you said it, you're gonna be put on the spot now because he's fixing to be put to death. And you better understand, if you give false witness, it goes the other way too.
Yeah.
You're an attorney. I've actually heard people talk about in this situation that, you know how when a jury renders a guilty verdict, they poll the jury? This is the same thing.
Yeah, good point.
You have to speak up and say, yes, you found him guilty.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's interesting how people will find somebody guilty. I've been in juries, they'll sit in the jury room, but when they have to still, and they poll them, they can't do it.
Yep. All right, anything else about that section? Good points raised. 17 through 23. Wanda, would you read it for us?
If anyone takes the life of a human being, he must be put to death.
Pause right there. If you ever have a question about whether the death penalty is biblical, here it is. There's a lot of debate about that these days, but it's here and it's in other places too. All right, read on.
Anyone who takes the life of someone's animal must make restitution, life for life. If anyone injures his neighbor, whatever he has done must be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. As he has injured the other, so he is to be injured.
Pause right there. This has been referred to in other places as lex talionis, or the law of retaliation. Some people think that this is a cruel thing, an eye for an eye, that's cruel punishment. But actually, this was a law of limitation. Think about it, because what might happen that if somebody injures, puts a person's eye out, what's the retaliation? They come out and they put two eyes out, or they kill them. Say no. The penalty, if you will, is going to be is equal to the harm inflicted. Now, what you might add is that really is the basis even of the tort system today. That if a person is injured, let's say, it's not an intentional injury, although it could be, but if it's an accidental injury, you're in a car wreck, and as a result, if the car wreck is your fault and you break somebody's arm, well, the idea is not that your arm is going to be broken, but that you have to pay compensation equal to the value of the broken arm, whatever that may be. And so this is supposed to be a law of equal justice and not excessive retaliation, if you will. All right, read on, verse 21.
Whoever kills an animal must make restitution, but whoever kills a man must be put to death. You are to have the same law for the alien and the native born. I am the Lord your God. Then Moses spoke to the Israelites, and they took the blasphemer outside the camp and stoned him. The Israelites did as the Lord commanded Moses.
It's interesting that the imposition of the death penalty is here linked to an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. The idea is, and tell me if you think it's a valid comparison, that if you curse God or if you blaspheme God, it is of the same character as killing someone else. In other words, it's equated to murder. And why is that? The idea is that the same evil in your heart that would cause you to kill someone else intentionally is the same motivation that would cause you to kill God. To blaspheme God or to curse God. They're both very, very sorry conditions of the heart, if you will. Okay. Now moving to chapter 22.
Well, 17,
Sure.
Isn't that the verse that most people who refuse to serve in the military use?
Yeah.
And how do you differentiate that?
Well, it is differentiated, isn't it? Of course, we're going to see later on that very often Israel is called to arms, so to speak, and they're called to go out and battle. In fact, when God ushered them into the promised land, what did he say to do with all the inhabitants there?
Wipe it out.
So,
It seemed like there's one is where God pronounces sentence on the people and they're executing it.
mm-hmm.
And the other is where you're taking the life of a person of your own accord.
That's right. It's a volitional act. That's right.
I don't know what the words are, but
Yeah.
it seems that.
Yeah, one is, and, go ahead.
Aren't we supposed to, it's in the Bible that we set up our own government and that we're supposed to follow those laws.
Yeah, yeah.
So if the law is that we're gonna have an enemy and we have to slay the enemy, then we have to go out there and slay the enemy.
Yeah.
And all we're doing is obeying man's law that he said, make the man's law and follow those laws.
Yeah.
So it eventually comes from God.
That's
I
right.
mean, that's the way I look at it.
That's right. And Paul clarifies that very well. I think it's pretty clear in the Old Testament. You read this and this injunction against killing somebody applies in this circumstance. That is, I individually, if I'm acting on my own of my own volition, I am prohibited from, just because I want to go out and killing somebody. However, a different standard applies to warfare, right? Or to pronouncing the death penalty. And there's certain things that have to be done, as Lindsay pointed out. Those who heard the offending act lay their hands, they pronounce the guilt, and then it's the community that stones the guilty person, not an individual. So yeah, there is quite a difference there, and Paul explains it very well. He says that the government of the governments are ordained by God. No king is in power except God puts him there. No government is in power unless God puts them there. And Paul says very clearly that the government does carry the sword. Speaking in terms of it is given the right, the God-given right to both execute the death penalty as well as to declare war. So I think there's a valid distinction there. All right, chapter 25 deals with the sabbatic year and the year of the Jubilee. This is very important for several reasons. We're going to talk about them in detail, what the Jubilee means, both in the Old Testament context as well as what it really means in the New Testament context. I thought it was kind of interesting, if you look in chapter 25, it begins, the Lord then spoke to Moses at Mount Sinai, saying, and if you look back, I saw that and I said, all right, that's interesting, they're still at Mount Sinai. And I checked a little bit back, a little bit forward. Anybody remember how much time they spent at Mount Sinai? First, when did they arrive at Mount Sinai? Anybody remember that? They left Egypt and they arrived there in the 3rd month of their first year, so to speak. All right. They had the Passover. They had the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Then they left Egypt. They crossed over, and it says that in the 3rd month of their first year, they arrived at Mount Sinai, and that's when God began giving them laws. We'll read over in Numbers that they first left Sinai in the second month of the second year. So they spent almost a full year in this area of Mount Sinai. And the reason they were there, and the reason they stayed in that area, is because you'll see almost every chapter of the book of Leviticus begins, if you look back at chapter 24, it says, "Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying," 23, "The Lord spoke to Moses, saying," chapter 22, "The Lord spoke to Moses, saying." It is Moses giving words to the people. That where does Moses get these words?
From God.
From God. So he's in close communion with God, again symbolized by being there close to Mount Sinai. So they're still in this area, and so all of these laws that we're reading about and studying the book of Leviticus, called the Levitical laws, are given by God to Moses, and Moses then pronounced them to the people. In a couple of chapters you'll see that it says Moses spoke to Aaron, or Moses spoke to the priests, saying. So certain laws were given specifically to the sons of Aaron, but most of them were given to Moses to be declared to all the people. And particularly this law of the Jubilee. Now, before we get into the details of the Jubilee, does anybody remember a New Testament reference to the Jubilee? It isn't spoken of directly as a pronouncement of the Jubilee, but it's right there. Let's hold what you have there in chapter 25, and let's all turn to Luke chapter 4, verse 14. This is going to remind you. Luke 4, chapter 14. Yeah, verse 14. And chronologically, where we are, everybody knows that in Luke 2, that tells the story of the birth of Jesus, and then he grows up. In chapter 4, the beginning of chapter 4, we have the temptation of Jesus, where he goes into the wilderness and he's tempted of Satan after his baptism. But then his public ministry begins, chapter 4, verse 14. And Brother Kenny, are you there yet?
Getting closer every minute.
Luke.
Luke.
That's the New Testament.
Yes, sir.
Chapter 4.
He's wounded.
But I get to pick on him because he's my brother.
That's right.
All right.
Chapter 4.
Chapter 4, we'll start reading verse 14.
Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit, and the news about him spread through the whole countryside. He taught in their synagogues, and everyone praised him. He went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went to the synagogue, as was his custom. And he stood up to read. The scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolled it, he found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor."
Read on.
Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him. And he began by saying to them, "Today the scripture is fulfilled in your hearing."
Pause right there. Today the scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. And the last where he spoke, of course, he's quoting from the book of Isaiah, and he says, "I have been sent to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord." Everybody knew what that meant. What was that?
The year of Jubilee.
That was a Jubilee. So, it is no coincidence that Jesus begins his ministry while they're celebrating the year of the Jubilee. And Jesus is basically saying here that I am the Jubilee. Everything you learned about the Jubilee and everything that you've been celebrating since the Levitical laws came down, ever since God established the rule and the law of the Jubilee, this has been pointing to me. This is what it's all about. So as we read about the establishment of the Jubilee in chapter 25, I want us to think about how this relates to Jesus and who he was and what he did. Okay. Back to Leviticus chapter 25. Coming from Mount Sinai. Kathy, you want to pick up there, chapter 25, verse 2.
Verse 2. Speak to the Israelites and tell them, when you enter the land I am giving you, the land you will observe the Sabbath to the Lord. You may sow your field for 6 years, and you may prune your vineyard and gather its produce for 6 years. But there will be a Sabbath of complete rest for the land in the 7th year, a Sabbath of the Lord. You are not to sow your field or prune your vineyard. You are not to reap what grows by itself from your crop, or harvest the grapes of your untended vines. It must be a year of complete rest for the land. Whatever the land produces during the Sabbath year can be food for you, for yourself, for your male or female slave, and the hired hand or foreigner who stays with you. All of its growth may serve as food for your livestock and the wild animals in the land.
Pause right there. But you just finished verse 7? Okay, so here, the first thing God says is when you get into the promised land, you can start tilling, after you clear it all out and get all the foreign people out. And that took them, I think, about 14 years to do that. But then when they were, quote unquote, at peace, then they were to begin this cycle that they would work, they would plant, they would harvest for 6 years. But then in the 7th year, the land was to have a complete rest. And for 7 years, they were not to till the land, they were not to plant, and they weren't, as I read this, they weren't supposed to go out and do a commercial harvest, if you will. In the 7th year, the land would rest. It would produce fruits. They could go out and get it as food for their family, but they couldn't engage in a commercial harvest, okay? So the land was to rest, and they were to rest in the 7th year. Now, why did God tell them to do that? What is the purpose of that? What is the purpose of not harvesting or planting in the 7th year?
Let the land rest.
Let the land rest, but just for the sake of letting the land rest?
I do know that in the 50s, that the federal government used to pay cotton farmers and everything like that there on the you can only plant so much cotton.
Yeah.
But if you had to lay by so much land every year and rotate it, and they paid you for it to do it, for what you had been making off the crop years gone by and everything.
Yeah, I was living in southern Illinois at the time. That was big corn and soybeans, and they did the same thing.
They call it diverted acres.
Yeah, and they call it the fallow, is what the farmers in my area call it.
They call it diverted acres, and we plow the hay under to let that do, but you couldn't.
You couldn't do nothing during the summertime,
but
let it lay.
So I think there is part for the land.
Yeah,
the land needs rest.
Yeah.
But I think too, God wants people not to think it's by your own work that you're making a living. That it's a good year to remember that this is God's gift. I would think.
No, I think that's exactly right. I think the real spiritual purpose of this, did it benefit the land? Yeah. But the most important thing was to benefit the people. And so that the people would know that, hey, I'm supposed to depend upon God. Just as God was our provider and our protector in the wilderness, He'll be our provider and protector in the promised land. And to acknowledge that, we're not going to work, and we're going to trust God to provide for us in that 7th year. And we're going to see later on that there's a harsh penalty that was predicted. That God says, if you don't do this, some bad things are going to happen. And we see later on that, hey, they didn't do it, and some bad things happened.
So way back in the 50s, the government was trying to take the place of God. Is that it? Depend on the government?
No, they were doing good. I wish they were still doing it.
I think they were looking at
a good government
that they didn't, deplete the land. And like now, if you look at farming now in the Midwest, a lot of them don't plow anymore. They just cut the ground because when they turn the ground over, the topsoil would blow off. So they're trying to. They just keep reinventing things, but land will.
It was a good program.
Yeah. The government's fine that when you obey God's laws, good things happen.
Yeah.
Who would have thought?
Yeah. That did work.
Yeah. Okay. Verse 8. Is that you, Nancy?
You shall count off 7 years. You shall count off 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the period of 7 weeks of years gives 49 years. Then you shall have the trumpet sounded loud on the 10th day of the 7th month, on the day of atonement. You shall have the trumpet sounded throughout all your land, And you shall hallow the 50th year, and you shall proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. You shall return, every one of you, to your property, and every one of you to your family.
Pause right there just a second. So get this. You go into the land, you observe the Sabbath every 7th year, you don't plant, you don't harvest, all right? Then you count 7 of those, and in the 49th year, so it'll be the 50th year, but after you've had 7 times 7 years, then on the Day of Atonement, the ram's horn blows and the Jubilee year is pronounced. And that's when they have the year of Jubilee, which to them was a very big deal, because you're going to see how big of a deal it is. Read on, Nancy.
That 50th year shall be a jubilee for you. You shall not sow or reap the aftergrowth or harvest the unpruned vines, for it is a jubilee. It shall be holy to you. You shall eat only what the field itself produces. In this year of jubilee you shall return, every one of you, to your property. When you make a sale to your neighbor or buy from your neighbor, you shall not cheat one another. When you buy from your neighbor, you shall pay only for the number of years since the jubilee. The seller shall charge you only for the remaining crop years. If the years are more, you shall increase the price, and if the years are fewer, you shall diminish the price. For it is a certain number of harvests that are being sold to you. You shall not cheat one another, but you shall fear your God, for I am the Lord your God. You shall observe my statutes and faithfully keep my ordinances, so that you may live on the land securely. The land will yield its fruit, you will eat your fill and live on it securely. You shall ask, what shall we eat in the 7th year if we may not sow or gather in our crop? I will order my blessing for you in the 6th year, so that it will yield a crop for 3 years. When you sow in the 8th year, you will be eating from the old crop. Until the 9th year, when its produce comes in, you shall eat the old.
All right. Pause up there just a second. So here we have a promise, and it's sort of like gathering the manna. God sent the manna for 6 days. On the 7th day, He didn't send any. On the 6th day, they gathered enough for the 7th day, and it held over. If you gathered too much before that, then what happened to it? The worms grew up in it. So here's the idea. People are saying, well, hey, if we don't sow or harvest in the 7th year, what's going to happen? God says, don't worry, because your harvest is going to be so bountiful in the 6th year that it's going to take care of you for the 6th year. All right, when you sow and harvest, it's going to take care of you for the 7th year when you don't do anything, and it's going to take care of you for the 8th year when you go out and you have to replant in that 8th year, so that on the 9th year the harvest comes in. So God says, I'm going to give you an abundance. All you have to do is what?
Trust me.
Trust me and do what I say, and everything's going to be fine. Now, we get an introduction to the year of the Jubilee. The year of the Jubilee is what we've learned so far. We're going to learn some more about it, but it is a year of release. All the debts are released, but more importantly, anybody who has sold his property for whatever reason and has left gets to come back and reclaim his property. Okay? Now you think,
The family property.
yeah, reclaim the family property, because what we're going to learn about later on is when the children of Israel move into the promised land, that they have some tribal allotments. So, all right. So but the idea is that, and we're going to see later on, that God is the one who actually owns the land. You know, we as human beings have developed this concept, this rather bizarre concept when you think about it, that I can put 4 iron pipes into God's earth and I can say, this is mine. You know, God laughs when we say that. Because you know you really can't own land, can you? The only thing you can have is a government or a legally protected right to spend your time on that land. But guess what? When your time runs out, you're not possessing that land anymore, are you? And so this is kind of a reminder of to the people of this fallacy of human ownership of land. So God says, this is my land. I'm going to put certain people on certain sections of land, and if you happen to mess up in the meantime, if you incur too many debts, or if you make some bad mistakes, if you make some quote-unquote bad choices, and you lose your land, in the 50th year, everything is going to be okay. I'm going to allow you to return back to the land. So, for the poor people, the year of Jubilee was a great thing. If you've made a lot of mistakes, if you have sinned, if you have transgressed God's laws, if you have made bad choices and lost your land, in the 50th year, everything is made right for you, right? You get to go back to your land and you get to reclaim it. Now you think, well, all right, for the debtor, it's a great thing. What about the creditor? If I'm the creditor and I'm the one who happens to have purchased this land from some wastrel, why should I have to give up this land that I've rightly acquired in the year of the Jubilee? That's not fair to me, is it?
Well, but it says that you can.
You conservative
should-
Republican, you?
you should pay for it based on the number of years, so it's really like renting.
Yeah, it
And
is.
they're leasing or something like that. So if you
That's
say
right.
I've got 10 years before Jubilee, I would only give what that 10-year crops is supposedly worth.
Exactly right. And so the idea of the purchase is that, you know, if the land was to be valued on the basis of the crops that it produced. So if a certain tract of land produced, let's use simple terms, if it produced $1,000 a year, okay, if you sold it the year after the Jubilee, if there's 48 years left to the next Jubilee, you pay $48,000 for it, because basically you're paying for the crops. So at the end of it, you know, it would go back and no harm, no foul. But the other thing, there's also a spiritual principle that applies to the conservative Republicans there, the creditors, and that is that the creditor should be willing to release the property and forgive the debt. Why? Because God has forgiven him. And so there's a twofold purpose. You know, for the debtor, it's a great release. He gets back that which he lost through his own sin. But from the creditor, the one who has taken possession of it, yet he's acknowledging God's grace and God's goodness. God has forgiven me, therefore I will forgive my fellow man.
But God has reminded him that the land is never yours anyway.
Exactly. That's right.
Do you think part of it though too was, as you mentioned, that this was because when they went into the promised land?
Yeah.
I mean, was the Jubilee created right here, right?
It was created, but it wasn't to apply until they got into the promised land.
Okay.
That's right. That's right.
I wonder how a system like that would work right now.
Man's too greedy.
Yeah. Well,
Lawyers would be.
all right. We don't finish today because of that. Okay. All the blame goes right there.
But everybody's made whole.
They
You know,
are.
everybody's made whole, and, but need might come in and,
Yeah, I was an economics major in college, so I'm thinking in the economic thought process.
Well, you know, it's an interesting,
You know?
you bring that up. You know, if you are like I am, you get concerned about what our federal government has done in income taxes. All right, and how you say, how did this evil thing ever begin? There was a time back in the 70s that the marginal income tax rate was up in the 90%. Now, not that high now, but it may be going back there. But I was doing a little research in conjunction with this, and it is said that at the time that the income taxes first became the law of the land, which is, somebody help me here, like in the early part of the 1900s, 1912, 1917. Income taxes, yeah. We didn't have income taxes, you know, before that. I mean, it's a fairly recent development in terms of world history, but it came about at some point in time, I think early part of the 20th century. As I recall, the income tax rate when it was first enacted was about 2%. And part of the justification for it, the arguments in Congress, is that this is the reflection of a biblical principle, the principle of the Jubilee. That every 50 years, everything returns back. 50 years, everybody who is poor gets back what they lost, and the idea of the 2%, and I think that was the rate that started out, is that if it goes back every 50 years, it's basically 2% per year. And so the idea is put your 2% up every year, and basically you're honoring the Jubilee. So,
Do you think God thought of it too, like, let's say every 50 years, it might be a new start of a new generation. In other words,
Yeah.
let's say your father put the family in debt,
yeah.
and then when the kids come up or something like that, maybe they have a chance to start
Right.
not from behind. You know what I mean? I don't know.
Yeah, no. That is an excellent point, because I think one of the real spiritual ideas of the Jubilee is just what Lon said, is the idea of a new beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And really, isn't that what Christ was all about when he came? He said, you know, Jesus said, this is the beginning. This is the real deal. Now, everything that happened in the past was pointing to me, and now I'm going to show you what Jubilee really is. It's the beginning of a new life. So I think that's an excellent point. But the other thing, to get back to Warren's question, you know, what if we did something like that today? Would it work any better? Well, guess what? The law of the Sabbath didn't work. The people didn't observe it back then, right? God says every seventh year you're not going to harvest and you're not going to plant. Did the people do that? No. Why did they harvest and why did they plant back then, even when God said don't do it in the seventh year?
Money.
Cheap.
Yeah. Two things: fear. of starvation and greed. They wanted to make more, and so they violated God's law for those two reasons. They didn't trust God, number one, and number two, they wanted more. And so we know what ultimately happened to them because of that. Yes, sir.
It's hard to how far if we go back, we'd have a lot of beads and moccasins.
Yeah, true enough. True enough. And just so the record is clear, I'm all in favor of 2% income tax. Okay. Verse 23. Who's next?
It said, I went back and looked, it said in, the income, it's the United States imposed income tax during the Civil War, briefly. But in the, 1913.
1913, okay, all right. 1913, so you think we think of the income tax as being around forever, like as part of the Constitution, or the Declaration of Independence, 1776. No, it's a fairly recent creature. Okay, verse 23, who's the next reader? Lynn?
Who's the president?
He started it, huh?
I think it was also supposed to be temporary when they
Yeah.
first did it. It was supposed to go away fairly quickly.
That was around the time of the beginning of World War
I was gonna say,
I.
And that's the reason it stayed to pay for the war.
Pay for the war,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Probably something different.
Who was the president?
I think it was Woodrow Wilson, wasn't it?
Yeah, several
He was
times.
in that area.
World War II is like,
But then the Great Depression came, nobody had it.
But once you give the government money, they're not gonna give it back.
That's what
Claim our
kills me about today, when they
Judeo-Christian
say,
law
oh, it's only
system,
gonna be for
just
10
kind of
years.
forgot about this one.
Yeah.
You'll never see the end of this guy.
But, like Tom said, they probably had good lawyers back in those days too. So
Okay, verse 23, Lynn.
The land must not be sold permanently, because the land is mine, and you are but aliens and my tenants. Throughout the country that you hold as a possession, you must provide for the redemption of the land. If one of your countrymen becomes poor and sells some of his property, his nearest relative is to come and redeem what his countryman has sold.
Pause right there. In verses 25 and 26 that Lynn is reading, we're talking about the nearest kinsman, or sometimes referred to as the kinsman redeemer. And you remember the kinsman redeemer in what book? In the book of Ruth. And the whole idea was that if a Jew got himself in trouble, got himself in debt, lost his property, okay, then his nearest relative or a nearest relative could come and redeem that which he had lost. And of course, this whole concept of kinsman redeemer refers to whom?
Jesus.
Jesus. He's our kinsman. He is our redeemer. He's a close relative, blood relative to all of us who claim his blood. Okay, read on.
If, however, a man has no one to redeem it for him, but he himself prospers and acquires sufficient means to redeem it, he is to determine the value for the years since he sold it, and refund the balance to the man to whom he sold it. He can then go back to his own property. But if he does not acquire the means to repay him, what he sold will remain in the possession of the buyer until the year of Jubilee. It will be returned in the Jubilee, and he can then go back to his property. If a man sells a house in a walled city, he retains the right of redemption a full year after its sale. During that time, he may redeem it. If it is not redeemed before a full year has passed, the house in the walled city shall belong permanently to the buyer and his descendants. If it is not returned, it is not to be returned in the Jubilee.
All right, pause right there. So a distinction is made between land, out of a field, if you will, and a house that's built within a walled city. The right of redemption of the land, that reverts every 50 years, and the right of redemption is essentially permanent, whereas the right of redemption of a house built in a walled city lasts for how long? 1 year. Why the distinction? What do you
real
think?
estate agent law.
That's right. Keep those sales going, keep those commissions going.
I think a house would be less permanent though.
Well, I mean, the idea of as who made the land versus who made the house,
Yeah.
right?
So it would be less permanent.
It's less permanent, that's right, because the man builds the house, whereas who made the land? Yeah, and so that which man creates with his hands doesn't get the same amount of honor that which God creates.
And there may be a factor of the field can sustain you, the house can't.
Exactly.
So the field's much more important than the house.
So if
But the
I,
house that's living on that little bitty parcel of land, that's still God's land.
Well, it is. You think about, I think about the house, when they used to build these houses inside a walled city, they typically build the houses right up against the wall, so they could, get the benefit of one wall, they wouldn't have to build so much. So I think of that, sometimes they build them on top of each other, right? Sort of condominium style. So if you have like 3 houses that are stacked one on top of the other up against the wall, you say, well, who owns the land? They probably didn't have a condominium declaration at the time, so but the whole idea is, this is something that's built by man, and so the same rule is not gonna apply to something that was made by God, namely the land. And so the idea is that if you have a big piece of land with a little house on it, the house is simply an adjunct to the land if the land is out in the field and is capable of sustaining crops. And the idea of the land, providing the crops to feed people is a symbol of God's sustenance, his providence, if you will.
They just dug up one of those cities. I saw it on television, that recent, they dug it up and, the wall and we think of, this room or whatever, they were very small. And I can't remember what the room was, but they just had rocks that they had stacked up and everything. And they found utensils and stuff in this room that they were digging in it. I think it was in Galilee, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I get excited every time I read about those things. We don't need tangible evidence to prove to us that the Bible is true, but you know what? Every time they find something, it just really thrills my heart.
so if I read this right or understood it right, so if I sold my land, but during the period of time of my life, I was able to buy it back, they have to sell it back to me?
They do, yeah.
It surprised God didn't, knowing man, God didn't say, but he gets his own crop that year. Because, a lot of people want.
Yeah, and the idea, God says, you got to be fair to each other.
That's right.
So in other words, if you sell it in the first year after the Jubilee, and you redeem it back after 5 years, and if the crop yielded $1,000 worth of, $1,000 every year, you had to give them credit.
So it's really just your leasing. I mean, the owner is always going to be.
That's basically what it is.
But
God's
most of the
always
time,
on.
everybody lived in the city, where they built the walls and everything else, and the houses were in there. Everybody owned the city. Even the people, if they were outside and had a place, they would come back into the walled city for protection. So that,
I think too, another point that Kenny raised about the walled cities is, walled cities are sort of a creation of man's. It's sort of like man's desire to have a king. At some point in time, the Israelites said, we want a king like everybody else has, right? God didn't like that. Why? Because God says, I'm your king.
Right. I'm your protection.
That's right. The same way they huddled into cities and they built walls around it for what? Protection. God said, you really don't need that because I'm your protector. If you just trust in me, you're not going to need a wall around you because I'm gonna surround you with a wall of fire, a wall of angels.
and usually the first thing that they built was a tower.
Yeah.
The tower, and then the wall and the residences against them.
Yeah. All right, let's jump down to verse 35. Lindsay, would you read that for us?
35, if one of your countrymen becomes poor and is unable to support himself among you, help him as you would an alien or a temporary resident so he can continue to live among you. Do not take interest of any kind from him and fear your God so that your countrymen may continue to live among you. You must not lend him money at interest or sell him food at profit. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and be your God. There's a Democrat.
Yeah.
If one of your countrymen becomes poor among you and sells himself to you, do not make him work as a slave. He is to be treated as a hired worker or a temporary resident among you. He is to work for you until the year of Jubilee. That's the basis of how most people came to this country.
That's right. Indentured service, that's right.
Yeah. Then children are to be released, and he will go back to his own clan and to the property of his forefathers, because the Israelites are my servants, whom I brought out of Egypt. They must not be sold as slaves. Do not rule over them ruthlessly, but fear your God. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you.
Pause. Go ahead, finish the sentence.
And members, oh, I lost my place name.
44.
Okay, and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can will them to your children as inherited property, and can make them slaves for lives, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly.
All right, pause right there. So, the question is, what does the Bible say about slavery? You know, here the Bible doesn't condemn slavery. You know, and so don't make any mistake about that either. There's an uproar these days. You know, oh, how evil America was for having slaves. Well, God did not prohibit slavery. And you think, well, slavery is a cruel institution. Why would God possibly allow slavery?
Those people could be in a better situation than what they came from.
Exactly.
And they're under the influence, hopefully, of godly people.
Yeah.
Who they can learn from.
But you see,
But they
that's,
were not God's people, because it says, God's people could not be sold.
No, but they can become God's people.
They can become God's
Yeah.
people.
Don't you see how-
You're right, they're not to begin with.
Yeah. But God's people, the Jews, were allowed to own slaves that they could purchase from foreign lands, from the pagans around them, and they could pass those slaves on to their heirs.
I was just gonna say, but if somebody's studying the Bible and young Christians, stuff
Yeah.
like that, I can see where they can get very confused. Because before we would say, see, God's not against the death penalty.
Yeah.
And here you can say, well, God's not against slavery.
Yeah.
I mean, so it's kind of is like we pick and choose what we want.
Well, but here's the thing about why did God, and Lindsay touched on it, why did God allow slavery to occur? Think about the first Jew who was a slave. Who was that?
Joseph.
Joseph. His own brothers sold him into slavery, all right? And, you know, he was a slave. He was in prison for a period of time. But then, when it came time for Joseph's payback and his brothers gathered around him and they were cowering, what did he say?
Well, God made it.
That's right.
You meant for evil, God meant for good.
Exactly right. He said, you didn't do this to me, God did this to me. What you intended for evil, God intended for good. God had a plan in Joseph's slavery. The children of Israel themselves were in slavery for 400 years. I believe, as a consequence of what those 11 brothers, or those 10 brothers did to Joseph, all right? But God let the Jews, his chosen people, be in slavery for 400 years. Did God have a purpose in that? Absolutely. He used that period of 400 years of slavery to grow them from about 70 people to probably 2 or 3 million people, who then he intended to move along. So, what is God's purpose in slavery? Well, that's the thing. Sometimes we don't know, but God uses slavery, that which men intend for evil, he uses for good. Now, you can think about the blacks in America today. They say, well, you know, it was evil for us to be bought and sold and moved to America. Well, guess what? That which the men intended for evil, God used for good. He made their lives better by moving them out of Africa and over to here. But again, you know, we can't support the institution of slavery. We just have to say that sometimes God allows it to happen. Why? So his purposes can be accomplished. You know, but does the scripture forbid slavery? It doesn't. I mean, you know, the Jews were allowed to own slaves.
Well, there are many examples of where God allowed bad things to happen,
That's right.
not just slavery.
That's right.
Well,
And
also,
today.
I'm sorry, I said I also get from the reading that the Israelites could not be enslaved because they're enslaved to God.
That's right.
They are his people, and whatever term you want.
That's right. And God wanted them to be as slaves to him. That's right. All right, once again, Tommy has kept us from finishing the book of Leviticus. I mean,
Well, I will.
let's put the blame where the blame is due.
Where?